the green world that had not yet arrived. There is a familiar picture of Earth that is almost impossible to unsee. Blue oceans, green continents, forests running toward distant mountains, soil beneath our feet, rivers carrying brown sediment toward the sea, leaves turning sunlight into living matter. For most of our lives, this feels like the default condition of a planet. It was not. For a vast portion of Earth's history, the continents were not covered by forests because forests did not exist. There were no tree-lined horizons, no deep woodland shade, no fallen leaves building a thick carpet beneath a canopy, no roots reaching meters into a mature soil. And yet, the ingredients for a green world were slowly gathering. Plants had begun to live on land. At first, they were small, simple, and tied closely to water. Their bodies rose only centimeters above the ground. They shared the surface with fungi, microbes, and tiny arthropods. The land was not empty, but it was nothing like a modern terrestrial ecosystem. Then something changed. Plants acquired new ways to move water through their bodies. They became taller. Their tissues became stronger. Their reproductive strategies became more flexible. Roots, or structures that performed some of the work of roots, began to reach into sediment. Wood appeared. Branching architectures became larger and more complex. Eventually, forests formed. The transformation was not a single event, and there was no single first tree that suddenly turned Earth green. It was a long evolutionary experiment, repeated in different forms by different plant groups. Some of those experiments ended, others spread. By the late Devonian, around 385 million years ago, landscapes existed that would have looked unmistakably like forest. Trunks rising above the ground, leafy structures catching the light, and extensive underground systems interacting with soils and water. The consequences reached far beyond plants. Forests changed the physical surface of continents. They altered weathering. They changed the movement of sediment into rivers. They created new habitats. They drew carbon into biological and geological cycles. They helped build deeper soils and more complicated food webs. The green world we know today was not simply waiting to be uncovered. It had to be built. And before we follow that transformation into its forests, we need to return to a time when the land was already being occupied by life, but not yet dominated by plants as we know them. The first chapter of this story is not about trees. It is about the ground beneath them. There is also a subtle difference between plant and forest that becomes important when we look at the fossil record. A plant can live on land without changing the land very much. A forest changes the scale of the interaction. Once many tall plants grow together, their roots occupy a large underground volume. Their leaves intercept a large fraction of incoming sunlight. Their stems create shade. Their dead tissues become a continuing source of organic material. The forest becomes an interface between several systems. Atmosphere above, soil below, water moving through and around it, rock beneath the soil, animals moving through the vegetation, microbes occupying almost every available surface. The more layers the forest contains, the more connections are possible. This is why the appearance of forests is better understood as an ecological threshold than as a single evolutionary invention. Several independent changes had to become compatible. Tall growth required structural support. Structural support required new tissues. Tall plants needed reliable water transport. Large bodies needed more extensive nutrient acquisition. Complex soils created opportunities for deeper roots, and taller vegetation created new habitats for animals. None of these innovations had to appear in exactly the same lineage. They only had to become common enough, often enough, for forest ecosystems to emerge. That is what makes the Devonian such a remarkable interval. It was not simply an age when plants became larger. It was an age when the land surface acquired a new architecture, the first living ground. The earliest land plants did not arrive on an empty continent. That distinction matters. Long before forests, the surfaces of continents could host microbial communities. Mats of cyanobacteria and other microorganisms could grow across damp sediment. Fungi occupied soil environments. Small organisms moved through thin layers of mineral particles and organic material. The terrestrial surface was already an ecosystem. but it was a shallow one. There was little vertical structure. There were few large bodies. There were no tall plants creating layers of shade and humidity. The boundary between living material and the mineral surface was comparatively close to the surface itself. The oldest evidence for land plants extends back hundreds of millions of years before the Devonian forests. By the Silurian, roughly 443 to 419 million years ago, evidence for simple land plants becomes increasingly clear. These early forms were not miniature versions of modern trees. They were small organisms adapted to conditions that were very different from those experienced by a mature woodland. Their bodies lacked the elaborate architecture of a modern flowering plant. Instead, many early land plants consisted of relatively simple axes and reproductive structures. Some possessed conducting tissues that allowed water and dissolved substances to move through the plant. Others belonged to lineages whose descendants would eventually become familiar as mosses, liverworts, vascular plants, and seed plants. But evolution did not solve every problem at once. Living on land is difficult. A plant that lives underwater is surrounded by water. Its tissues are supported by the medium around them, and water can be absorbed directly across surfaces. Plant on land must avoid drying out while still exchanging gases with the atmosphere. It must support its own body. It must obtain mineral nutrients from a surface that is not already dissolved around it. And reproduction introduces another challenge. Early land plants retained strong connections to wet environments. In many lineages, the movement of sperm still depended on water. That meant that a dry landscape was not simply an open opportunity. It was a risk. The first terrestrial plants, therefore, did not immediately spread across every continent. They occupied suitable places, wet margins, damp sediments, floodplain environments, geothermal settings, places where water periodically returned to the surface. One of the most remarkable windows into this early world is preserved in Scotland. The Rhynie chert formed around 400 million years ago and contains exceptionally preserved remains of an early terrestrial ecosystem. The fossils include plants, arthropods, fungi, algae, and microscopic organisms. In some specimens, tissues are preserved at a level of detail that allows researchers to examine internal structures. The landscape represented by these rocks was not a forest. The plants were small, but that makes the fossils more important, not less. They show that a terrestrial ecosystem could already contain interactions between organisms that resemble the beginnings of relationships familiar from modern soils. Fungi lived with plants. Microorganisms occupied the sediment. Tiny arthropods moved through the environment. Plants grew around pools and wet surfaces. The land was becoming biologically connected. The forest would come later. For now, the great innovation was simply this. Life was establishing itself where the ocean no longer surrounded it. And once life began altering the surface of the continents themselves became part of the evolutionary experiment. There is another reason the first terrestrial ecosystems matter. The land surface is where geology and biology meet most directly. Rock is not inert once water, gases, microbes, and organic molecules begin interacting with it. A thin film of moisture can carry dissolved chemicals. Microbial communities can alter local chemistry. Fungi can penetrate mineral surfaces. Plants can create organic acids and physically enter cracks. Over time, the distinction between rock and soil becomes less absolute. Early soils were probably patchy and thin compared with many modern soils. Some may have been little more than weathered mineral material mixed with microbial remains. Others developed in places where water and volcanic activity created unusually favorable conditions. The Rhynie environment is a useful example because its preservation is tied to geothermal water. Silica-rich fluids rapidly entombed organisms and sediments, producing a geological snapshot of a community that would otherwise have disappeared. That snapshot also corrects a common misconception. The earliest land ecosystems were not dominated by plants alone. They contained communities. Fungi were there. Microbes were there. Arthropods were there. Small aquatic and semi-aquatic organisms were there. Plants were entering a pre-existing biological landscape and changing it while depending upon it. This is why the evolution of roots cannot be separated completely from the evolution of soils. A root is not merely a pipe for water. It is a biological structure interacting with minerals, fungi, microbes, and animals. The deeper those structures penetrate, the more volume of the continental surface becomes biologically active. That expansion would become one of the great transformations of the Devonian. The word, wood, also deserves caution. Modern wood is a specialized material produced by particular groups of vascular plants, and Devonian woody tissues were not all equivalent. Different lineages solved mechanical and hydraulic problems in different ways. Some produced dense supportive tissues. Others used unusual networks of conducting cells. Some trees had relatively narrow trunks with complex internal organization. Others had architectures that would be almost impossible to confuse with a modern oak if we could see them standing. This diversity is important because it shows that there was no single recipe for becoming tall. Evolution found several. The tree habit was valuable enough to evolve repeatedly, but each lineage reached it by a different route. That repeated evolution is one of the clearest signs that the ecological opportunity was real. Once a plant could rise above its neighbors, sunlight rewarded the investment. Once it could support a larger body, it could occupy more space. Once roots could explore deeper sediment, the plant could access resources beyond the immediate surface. The forest therefore created a powerful feedback. Height created opportunity. Opportunity favored height, but every advantage came with costs. A tall plant required more structural material. It had to transport water farther. It was exposed to wind. It could be damaged by drought or flooding. Its tissues had to survive when the environment changed. The Devonian forests were not effortless expansions. They were the result of plants solving increasingly difficult engineering problems. A body built for land. The first land plants faced a problem that every later tree would solve on a much larger scale. How do you move water upward? A small plant can remain close to the moisture it needs. A taller plant cannot. As plants became larger, the distance between their photosynthetic tissues and their sources of water increased. The solution was vascular tissue, internal conducting systems that could move water and dissolved substances through the body. This did not appear as a single invention in a single species. Plant evolution is a branching history, and different groups developed different combinations of tissues and architectures. But vascular plants opened a new possibility. Height. A plant no longer had to remain a low mat pressed against damp ground. It could raise its photosynthetic structures above its neighbors. That created a new kind of competition. Light is directional. When several plants occupy the same ground, the taller one can intercept sunlight before it reaches the smaller one. Height, therefore, became valuable. But height creates another engineering problem. A vertical body must support itself. Modern trees accomplish this with wood, bark, roots, branching trunks, and sophisticated vascular systems. Devonian plants developed their own versions of these solutions. Some lineages evolved woody tissues and tree-like growth independently. Others produced large bodies with architectures that have no close modern equivalent. The result was not one evolutionary path toward the tree. It was a landscape filled with experiments. Cladoxylopsids formed branching, tree-like structures with complex internal anatomy. Lycopsids would eventually include giant trees with distinctive root systems. Progymnosperms, such as Archaeopteris, combined features associated with several major plant innovations and became among the most important trees of the late Devonian. Before these forests matured, however, there was another transformation taking place below ground. Soil. Modern soil is not simply crushed rock. It is a living interface between atmosphere, water, minerals, microbes, fungi, plants, and animals. Early terrestrial environments were much simpler. The arrival and diversification of land plants began to change that. Roots and root-like structures penetrated sediment. They physically disturbed mineral surfaces. They created channels. They altered the movement of water. They introduced organic matter into places that previously had far less. Fungi became especially important. The fossil record indicates that plant-fungus associations are extremely ancient. At Rhynie, fungal structures occur in close association with early plants. Such relationships may have helped plants obtain nutrients and water from immature soils. This is a recurring pattern in the history of life. An evolutionary innovation rarely operates alone. A plant body depends on a conducting system. A conducting system depends on tissues and chemistry. Those tissues exist inside an ecosystem of microbes. The plant grows in soil shaped by water and minerals. The soil influences rivers. Rivers carry material to oceans. The consequences of terrestrialization, therefore, cannot be contained within botany. The continents themselves begin to behave differently. As vegetation expanded, weathering processes changed. Plant tissues and roots interact with rock. Biological activity can accelerate the breakdown of minerals. Carbon dioxide participates in weathering reactions that ultimately move carbon between the atmosphere, rocks, soils, rivers, and oceans. This does not mean that the first forests simply switched off global warming. The Devonian climate was controlled by many interacting factors, and researchers continue to debate the relative importance of vegetation, continental configuration, atmospheric carbon dioxide, orbital conditions, ocean circulation, and other processes. But the arrival of plants added a powerful new component to the Earth system. The continents now had a biological surface. The geometry of early plants can seem strange because our eyes are trained by modern vegetation. We expect leaves to be broad and flat, trunks to be continuous cylinders, and branches to divide in familiar patterns. Devonian plants often broke those expectations. Some had branching systems that divided repeatedly near their growing tips. Some produced narrow appendages rather than broad leaves. Some developed woody tissue without resembling a modern tree in overall appearance. This diversity is evidence of experimentation. The tree habit did not arrive as a finished package. It was assembled from traits. Support can be improved. Water transport can be improved. Light capture can be improved. Reproduction can be separated from immediate contact with wet surfaces. The growing tip can branch. The body can become thicker. Roots can spread laterally. Each change creates new possibilities for the next. One of the most significant shifts was the appearance of deeper and more extensive root systems. A shallow plant interacts with only a thin layer of sediment. A rooted tree interacts with a much larger volume. That means the plant is no longer simply occupying the ground. It is restructuring it. The ancient root systems preserved at some Devonian sites are especially valuable because they show that forests had underground architecture comparable in ecological importance to what was visible above ground. A forest is therefore only half visible. The canopy tells us where sunlight was captured. The roots tell us where water and nutrients were explored. The soil records the interaction between both. The first forests also change how paleontologists think about scale. A fossil plant can tell us about anatomy. A fossil soil can tell us about environment. A fossil forest can tell us about an entire community. At a forest site, the positions of trunks and roots can reveal spacing. The dimensions of stems can suggest growth strategies. Different root systems can indicate different ecological roles. Sediment can tell us whether the forest stood on a floodplain or another setting. This is why exceptional fossil sites are so valuable. They preserve relationships. The history of life is often lost when organisms are found as isolated fragments. A leaf in one rock and a root in another may belong to different plants, different environments, or different ages. A forest floor can bring several pieces together. The Cairo site is especially important in this respect. It preserves the root systems of a Devonian forest rather than simply a collection of transported trunks. That evidence allowed researchers to reconstruct how trees occupied the landscape and to recognize that some early trees possessed root systems with surprisingly modern ecological functions. Other sites preserve different kinds of information. The famous fossil forests of Gilboa, New York, for example, have provided evidence of Middle Devonian tree communities and helped reveal the diversity of early forest architectures. The record is still incomplete, but every new site can change the picture. A new root system may show that a plant grew differently than expected. A new trunk may reveal an unfamiliar architecture. A new fossil soil may shift estimates of how deeply plants penetrated the ground. Deep time is reconstructed one preserved relationship at a time. The forests begin. Around the middle of the Devonian, roughly 390 million years ago, the landscape began to acquire something genuinely new. Trees. Not modern trees, but organisms with trunks, branching structures, and enough height to create a vertical environment. This distinction is important because the word tree describes a growth form rather than one single evolutionary lineage. Several groups evolved tree-like bodies independently. The first forests were therefore not a uniform woodland. They were experiments in architecture. Some forests were dominated by cladixylipsids. Their trunks could be tall, but their internal structure was unlike that of a modern oak or pine. Others included early lycopsids and progymnosperms. The forests were also geographically uneven. Fossil evidence suggests that early forest ecosystems were strongly influenced by local environments. Some grew near water, some occupied floodplains, some were associated with coastal or lowland settings, and the fossil record is incomplete. True in-place fossil forests are rare because forests must be buried under very particular conditions for their arrangement to survive. A tree can fall, decay, and disappear without leaving a recognizable forest. A flood can move trunks downstream. Erosion can destroy roots. Sediment can preserve one part of an ecosystem while removing another. So when paleobotanists reconstruct Devonian forests, they often work from fragments. Fossilized roots, trunks, leaves, spores, wood, sediment, and the geological relationships between them. Sometimes the evidence is astonishingly direct. At a site near Cairo, New York, researchers discovered a fossil forest preserving the root systems of trees that lived around 385 million years ago. The roots belonged to Archaeopteris. The trees were not identical to modern forests, but the architecture of their underground systems was strikingly familiar. Archaeopteris is especially important because it combined several features associated with later forest trees. It could grow tall. It produced woody tissue. It developed large lateral branches, and its leaves were adapted to capturing sunlight efficiently. Its roots extended into the soil. Together, these traits made Archaeopteris an extraordinarily effective forest-forming plant. Some estimates place the tallest Devonian Archaeopteris trees at around 30 to 40 meters, although exact heights remain reconstruction dependent. A 30-meter tree is not merely a large plant. It is a new environment. The air moves differently around it. Light becomes stratified. Humidity changes with height and distance from the ground. Dead plant material accumulates. Animals gain surfaces on which to climb. Water is intercepted by branches and leaves before reaching the soil. Roots occupy underground space. The forest creates its own gradients, and once a vertical world exists, evolution has new places to explore. The first forests were therefore not just collections of larger plants. They were habitat machines. The fossil site at Cairo is especially revealing because the roots preserve the spacing and organization of trees across an ancient landscape. Instead of a single isolated trunk, researchers can study an underground community. That changes the question. We are no longer asking, did this plant have roots? We can ask how the plants occupied space. Were they growing close together? Did their root systems overlap? Were different kinds of plants occupying different depths? What kind of sediment surrounded them? And what does that tell us about the forest itself? Archaeopteris is also significant because it was not simply tall. Its architecture combined traits that made it well suited to becoming a dominant forest organism. It had leaves that could capture light efficiently, wood that could support a substantial body, and extensive roots. Those traits allowed it to exploit both vertical and horizontal space. The result was a tree that could alter its environment at a scale far beyond that of a low-growing plant. A mature tree intercepts rainfall before it reaches the ground. It shades the surface. It adds organic matter when tissues die. It creates protected spaces around its trunk and roots. It changes local wind. It changes humidity. Every one of these effects feeds back into the organisms living nearby. The forest is therefore a physical structure built by living organisms. That is why the emergence of trees marks such a major transition in Earth history. One of the most striking things about the Devonian forest is how quickly the idea of land becomes difficult to separate from the idea of water. Forests grew where water was available. Rivers carried their nutrients in sediments. Floods buried their remains. Wetlands preserved organic material. Rain fed the roots. Groundwater sustained the vegetation. The trees then altered how that water moved across the surface. This feedback between vegetation and hydrology is familiar today, but its deep history is ancient. A rooted landscape can slow runoff. It can store water in soil. It can create channels of preferential flow. It can trap sediment. It can alter where a river cuts and where it deposits. The Devonian was therefore a period when plants began influencing the architecture of river systems themselves. That influence did not make every Devonian river look modern. Far from it. Ancient river systems could be broad, mobile, and braided, and the effect of vegetation varied with climate, sediment supply, and plant community. But the important transition was underway. The surface of the continent was no longer simply a boundary between atmosphere and rock. It had become a biologically active skin. A continent changes shape. Stand in a modern forest, and it is easy to think of trees as scenery. In deep time, trees were geological actors. The most important changes may have happened where we cannot see them. Below ground, a root system changes how water moves through sediment. It opens pathways. It binds particles. It creates a zone of biological activity. When rain falls on vegetated land, the water encounters a surface that is chemically and physically different from bare rock. Some sediment is held in place. Some is transported. Some is trapped by vegetation. And some is carried into rivers. This altered the relationship between land and water. The Devonian was a period of major changes in river systems. The spread of vegetation helped stabilize some channels and floodplains, while also increasing the complexity of sedimentary environments. But the effects of plants reached even farther. Weathering liberates elements from rocks. Plants and associated microbes can increase the contact between minerals, water, and reactive compounds. The resulting products can be transported by rivers into the oceans. That creates a connection between a leaf on a continent and chemistry in a marine basin hundreds or thousands of kilometers away. The Devonian fossil record contains evidence of major changes in marine environments, including episodes of widespread oxygen depletion and biological crisis. It would be too simple to say that forests caused these events. They did not. The Devonian was climatically and tectonically complex, and researchers continue to investigate how terrestrial and marine processes interacted. But plants became part of the network. More vegetation meant more biological processing of the continental surface. More roots meant more interaction with rock. More organic matter meant more material entering soils and sediments. The planet was acquiring feedbacks that had not existed on the same scale before. This is one reason the evolution of plants is more than a story of increasingly impressive organisms. It is a story about Earth becoming coupled to life in new ways. The continents stopped being merely the places where life happened to live. They became active parts of the biosphere, and the forests changed the meaning of the word land. Land could now contain layers. There was a canopy. There was an understory. There was a surface litter zone. There were soils. There were roots. There were microbes. There were animals moving through stems and sediment. The three-dimensional ecosystem had arrived. The geological record offers several ways to see this transformation. One is sediment. When rivers cross a vegetated floodplain, roots can reinforce the banks and plants can trap material. The result can be different from the deposits produced by a landscape with little vegetation. Another is ancient soil. Paleosols can preserve horizons, root traces, chemical alteration, and other clues to how long a surface remained exposed. Another is charcoal. Charcoal survives where ordinary plant tissue is destroyed, providing evidence that vegetation burned. And another is the chemistry of rocks. Changes in the composition of sediments can record shifts in weathering and the movement of elements from continents toward the sea. No single record tells the entire story. Together, they allow researchers to reconstruct a planet in transition. This is also why claims about climate must be handled carefully. The Devonian was not a single climate. It lasted roughly 60 million years, longer than the entire history of our genus Homo by an extraordinary margin. Continents move, sea levels change, ice may have appeared at particular times, ocean circulation shifted, atmospheric composition changed. Vegetation was one component in a moving system. The first forests did not control Earth. They became part of Earth. That distinction is essential to understanding deep time. The geography of these forests was also unlike the geography of modern forests. The continents were arranged differently. During the Devonian, large landmasses occupied different latitudes and were separated by seas that no longer exist. What is now North America was assembled from pieces of ancient continental crust. Parts of Europe were connected within a landmass sometimes called Laurussia or Euramerica. Gondwana occupied a vast portion of the southern hemisphere. A forest growing on one of these ancient continents was therefore living under a sky above a geography that would eventually disappear. Even the word continent can mislead. The outlines visible on a modern map are the end result of hundreds of millions of years of plate movement. A Devonian river system could occupy a landscape that later crossed an ocean, collided with another continent, was buried, uplifted, eroded, and finally exposed again as a rock outcrop. This is one reason fossil forests can be found far from the climates we associate with them. The rock remembers where it was deposited. The modern landscape does not necessarily resemble the ancient one. That separation between present geography and ancient geography is essential when reconstructing deep time. A fossil root in a modern desert does not mean a tree once grew in a desert. It may mean that the rock preserving the root was formed in a humid environment hundreds of millions of years ago and later moved through the machinery of plate tectonics. The forest was not only changing the biology of the land itself was moving beneath it. The rise of forests also changed what it meant for an animal to be terrestrial. Before complex vegetation, much of the terrestrial surface was physically close to the mineral ground. With forests, an animal could occupy a world above that surface. Climbing becomes possible. Shelter becomes possible. Three-dimensional movement becomes possible. The same principle appears in modern forests, where an animal can spend its entire life without regularly touching open ground. Devonian ecosystems were not modern versions of this arrangement, but the opportunity itself had appeared. Animals could interact with plants as structures rather than merely as scattered food. This is a major ecological transition. The plant body becomes habitat. A tree trunk is no longer only a support column. It is a surface. Its branches are corridors. Its roots create protected spaces. Its fallen wood becomes another habitat after death. The forest continually produces new environments from its own tissues. This is why the evolution of forests cannot be separated from the later diversification of terrestrial animals. The plants did not simply provide food. They reorganized space. The animals follow the green. Animals had already begun exploring land before forests became widespread. Arthropods were among the earliest successful terrestrial animals. In the early Devonian world, recorded at Rhynie, tiny arthropods lived among plants and microbial communities. They did not need a forest canopy. They could live close to the ground. But as vegetation became taller and more structurally complex, the opportunities multiplied. A stem is a surface. A branch is a path. A root is a tunnel. A leaf is food, shelter, or both. A forest creates thousands of ecological niches that do not exist on open ground. The animals did not simply arrive after the forests were complete. Plants and animals evolved alongside one another. Some animals fed on plant tissues. Others consumed fungi or detritus. Predators followed prey. Decomposers processed dead material. This creates a basic rule of ecosystems. Complexity creates opportunity. The Devonian land surface was becoming more complicated at every level. Above ground, plants grew taller. Below ground, roots and microbial communities occupied new volumes of soil. Between them, arthropods moved through a world that increasingly resembled an ecosystem rather than a thin biological film. Vertebrates were also changing. The Devonian is famous for the diversification of fishes, but some vertebrate lineages began experimenting with life near and eventually beyond the water. The transition from aquatic to terrestrial vertebrates was not caused simply by forests. It had its own evolutionary history. Fins changed, muscles changed, skeletons changed, sensory systems changed, breathing systems changed, but forests altered the landscape into which these animals could move. A stream bordered by vegetation is different from a bare shoreline. A floodplain with rooted plants holds water and sediment differently. A forested wetland offers cover, food, and structural complexity. The land was becoming habitable in new ways, and the more complex it became, the more difficult it was to describe it as merely dry land. It was a world. By the late Devonian, the continent supported forests in multiple forms. The plants were still unlike the dominant trees of later eras, but the basic architecture of terrestrial ecosystems had changed permanently. The ocean was no longer the only place where large, complex ecological interactions occurred. The continents had their own. The forest also created a new problem for decomposers. A large tree represents a huge investment of carbon and structural material. When that tree dies, the ecosystem must process it. Modern forests depend on fungi, bacteria, detritivores, and animals to break down dead wood and return nutrients to the soil. The Devonian decomposer communities were different from modern ones, and the efficiency of ancient wood decay is an active area of research. The fossil record preserves fungal interactions with early plants, but it does not give us a complete picture of every process occurring in a Devonian forest. What it does show is that decay was already part of the system. Dead material became another habitat. A fallen stem could remain on the surface, enter sediment, or be consumed by organisms. The boundary between living forest and geological deposit was therefore constantly shifting. A tree could become soil. Soil could become sediment. Sediment could become rock. Millions of years later, that rock could preserve the outline of the ecosystem. Deep time is full of these transformations. The transition to forests also changed the scale at which life could interact. A low plant occupies a narrow vertical zone. A tree occupies a column. That column contains light at the top, dimmer conditions below, moving air, branches, bark surfaces, leaf litter, and roots underground. Even before the appearance of modern forest animals, the creation of this vertical space opened opportunities. An arthropod could climb. A predator could move along the surface. A decomposer could occupy dead wood. A microbe could live inside plant tissue. A fungus could extend through soil. The forest effectively multiplied habitat without multiplying land area. This is one reason terrestrial ecosystems could become increasingly diverse without requiring the continents themselves to become larger. Complexity was being added in 3 dimensions. The same principle can be seen in the oceans, where reefs create vertical structure and shelter. But a forest was a terrestrial version of this ecological engineering. The canopy was especially important. Once plants rose above one another, sunlight became a limited resource. Leaves near the top received more light. Lower tissues experienced shade. Plants could respond by changing their growth forms, leaf arrangements, and branching patterns. The competition for light became a force-shaping architecture. A tree did not simply grow tall because height looked impressive. Height could determine whether its photosynthetic tissues received light. That makes the Devonian forest a place of competition as well as cooperation. The same plant body could participate in several ecological relationships at once. It competed with neighboring plants. It partnered with fungi. It provided habitat for animals. It altered the soil. It changed water movement, and after death, it became material for another community. A forest is an ecosystem because these processes are connected. The hidden cost of going green, the rise of forests, was transformative. It was not necessarily gentle. When life changes the chemistry of a planet, there can be consequences. Plants remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere during photosynthesis. Carbon can later become part of organic matter, soil, sediment, or eventually rock. Plant-driven weathering can also alter the movement of elements through rivers. These processes interact with climate. Some models have suggested substantial Devonian changes in atmospheric carbon dioxide associated with the expansion of land plants. Other modeling work emphasizes that the climatic effect of vegetation depends on several competing factors, and that the Devonian climate cannot be reduced to one simple plant-driven mechanism. That uncertainty is useful. It reminds us that Earth systems are not simple machines. A forest does not have one effect. It has many. Vegetation can darken a landscape, changing how much sunlight the surface reflects. It can increase evaporation and alter moisture. Roots can increase weathering. Soils can store carbon. Rivers can transport dissolved and particulate material. Organic matter can enter wetlands and sediments. The net climate effect depends on how these processes interact. The same is true of oxygen. It is tempting to imagine the first forests as immediately creating an oxygen-rich atmosphere. The reality is slower and more complicated. Photosynthesis produces oxygen, but atmospheric oxygen depends on whether reduced carbon and other materials are buried rather than rapidly oxidized again. Large changes in atmospheric composition therefore emerge from the balance between production, consumption, burial, and geological processes. The forest was not simply an oxygen factory. It was part of a global chemical system. That system was still evolving. And then there was another consequence. Fire. Once plants became abundant enough on land, combustible organic matter became a persistent component of the surface environment. Fossil charcoal records provide evidence that wildfire was already occurring hundreds of millions of years ago. Fire would become an important ecological force in later terrestrial ecosystems, but its deep history reaches back into the early age of land plants. The existence of fire changes the landscape. It removes vegetation. It exposes soil. It redistributes nutrients. It creates opportunities for new growth. But the relationship between early plants and fire was not identical to modern forest ecology. The structure, moisture, and fuel loads of Devonian ecosystems varied widely. The important point is simply that once plants occupied continents at large scales, they created entirely new geological and ecological processes. The green world had become self-altering. The story of reproduction is equally important. Modern forests are filled with seeds. The Devonian forest was not. Many early tree-forming plants reproduced by spores. Spores are remarkably effective at dispersal, but they have limitations. Their biology often remained linked to moisture, and the reproductive cycle of early vascular plants was different from that of later seed plants. The seed would eventually become one of the great innovations in terrestrial plant history. But during the Devonian, forests were already possible before seeds became dominant. This is another reminder that evolution does not wait for the final version of an innovation. Plants could become tall before they had modern seeds. They could form forests while still relying on reproductive strategies that would later be displaced or supplemented. The first forest was therefore not a primitive copy of a modern forest. It was a different solution. Its plants were living with a different atmosphere, different animals, different microbes, different continents, and different evolutionary possibilities. The forest was modern only in the broadest sense. A community of organisms using vertical space and interacting with the land surface. Everything else was strange, not one first forest. The phrase, the first forest, sounds as though paleontologists could point to one location and say, here is where the forest began. The evidence is more interesting than that. Forests evolved as a series of overlapping experiments. Different plants became tall at different times. Different architectures appeared. Different ecosystems occupied different climates and landscapes. Some forest types were short-lived. Others became widespread. The early Devonian plants of the Rhynie chert were not the direct blueprint for every later forest. They were part of a much older branching story. By the Middle Devonian, cladoxylopsid-dominated forests existed. Anaerophytes formed large woody structures without looking like modern trees. Lycopsids developed their own tree-like forms. And Archaeopteris became one of the most influential forest trees of the late Devonian. This diversity matters because evolution does not work toward a predetermined modern endpoint. The Earth did not need trees. There was no evolutionary instruction manual saying that continents should eventually resemble modern woodland. Trees emerged because particular combinations of structures worked under particular environmental conditions. Some survived, some disappeared, some left descendants. The forest is therefore an emergent phenomenon. It appears when enough plant innovations interact with enough ecological space. A trunk alone is not a forest, neither is a leaf, neither is a root. A forest is a network of organisms occupying vertical and horizontal space, interacting with atmosphere, water, sediment, microbes, animals, and one another. The Devonian forests were the first great version of that network, and their appearance changed the fossil record itself. Plants became easier to preserve, wood accumulated, roots penetrated ancient soils, leaves and branches entered sediments. Pollen and spores became abundant evidence of vegetation, although many modern plant reproductive structures had not yet evolved. Ancient soils, known as paleosols, preserve traces of these changes. Channels record river behavior. Sedimentary layers record floods. Root systems reveal where vegetation stood. Charcoal records ancient fires. The landscape became readable. Before forests, much of terrestrial history was written in smaller traces. After forests, the continent began leaving a richer geological archive of biological activity. We can now look at a rock and sometimes see not just an organism, but the environment in which it lived. A root system can reveal the shape of a vanished soil. A trunk can reveal how a tree grew. A fossil forest can reveal spacing between individuals. Sediment can reveal whether the trees lived beside a river, wetland, or volcanic landscape. Deep time becomes visible through structure. There's also a useful lesson in the names of the plants. Many Devonian trees are known from fossils that preserve only particular parts of their bodies. A trunk may once have been assigned a different name from a leaf or root because scientists did not yet know they belonged to the same organism. As new discoveries connect these pieces, reconstructions change. This is normal science. A fossil forest is not a photograph waiting to be developed. It is a puzzle assembled from evidence. That evidence can be strong in one respect and uncertain in another. A fossil root can prove that roots existed in a particular sediment. It may not reveal the complete shape of the tree above it. A leaf can show morphology. It may not reveal exactly how high the plant grew. A preserved forest floor can show spatial relationships. It may not capture the entire surrounding ecosystem. Good reconstruction keeps those distinctions visible. The first forests are compelling enough without pretending that every detail is known. There is a temptation to describe the Devonian as the moment when plants conquered land. The phrase is vivid, but it can hide the real story. Plants did not defeat the land. They entered into a partnership with it. They depended on water, minerals, sunlight, microbes, fungi, and geological processes. They also changed those same conditions. The relationship was reciprocal. Plants altered the environment. The altered environment created new opportunities for plants. Animals responded. Microbes responded. Rivers responded. Sediments responded. The atmosphere responded. And evolution continued inside the new world that life itself had helped create. This feedback is one of the central ideas of Earth history. Life is not simply an occupant of the planet. Life is one of the forces that shapes the planet. The Devonian forests make that principle visible, the world after green. Once forests existed, there was no returning to the earlier world, not because every later landscape was forested. Much of Earth would remain desert, tundra, grassland, wetland, rocky coast, or open woodland at different times. The point is that forests had become one of the planet's permanent ecological possibilities. Later plant groups would transform them again. Seed plants would spread. Gymnosperms would become important. Eventually, flowering plants would revolutionize terrestrial ecosystems. Grasses would create enormous open landscapes. Leaves would become food for increasingly diverse herbivores. Soils would deepen and diversify. But the basic idea had already appeared in the Devonian. A plant could build upward. A plant could build downward. A continent could become biologically structured. The consequences of that first forested world extend into the present. Every time a modern tree sends roots into soil, catches rain on leaves, stores carbon in wood, or creates shade beneath its canopy, it participates in processes whose deep evolutionary history reaches back hundreds of millions of years. The modern forest is not a Devonian forest with better equipment. It is the result of hundreds of millions of years of replacement, extinction, innovation, and ecological change. But its architecture has an ancient ancestor, a vertical world, a rooted world, a world in which life modifies the environment and then lives inside the environment it has modified. That may be the most important lesson of the first forests. Earth did not become green simply because plants appeared. Earth became different because plants began changing the conditions in which life existed. The first plants occupied the margins. Then they entered the sediments. Then they grew taller. Then they developed woody bodies. Then forests appeared. And once forests existed, animals, rivers, soils, atmosphere, and climate were all interacting with a continent that had been fundamentally reorganized by life. The transition was gradual. There was no morning when the barren earth woke up beneath a green canopy. Instead, there were hundreds of millions of years of small innovations. A conducting strand, a new branching pattern, a fungal partnership, a deeper penetration into sediment, a stronger tissue, a larger leaf, a taller stem, a new way to reproduce. Again and again, small changes accumulated. Then one day, in geological terms, there was a forest, and the planet had acquired a new kind of landscape. When we look at a forest now, it can seem timeless. It is not. The forest is an evolutionary invention. The soil beneath it is an ecosystem. The shape of the river beside it is partly a biological story. The chemistry of the atmosphere above it is linked to life below, and the idea that continents could be covered in towering vegetation was once as unfamiliar to Earth as a forest would be to a bare rock today. The green world had to begin somewhere, not with a tree, not with a single species, but with life learning, step by step, how to live on land. That is where the story begins, and that is how Earth learned to grow a forest.